Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, stood in the middle of his Bel Air mansion, surrounded by his closest friends. But it wasn't the music, the laughter, or the party that caught his attention. It was the two-way mirror in the changing room by the pool. The girls didn't know it was there, but Elvis and his friends did. They thought it was funny, a twisted form of entertainment. Elvis smirked, but deep down he felt a pang of guilt. He knew it was wrong, but he didn't stop it. He was Elvis, after all, and the rules didn't apply to him. The year was 1961, and Elvis was at the peak of his fame. He was the biggest box office draw in the world, and his music was playing everywhere. But behind the glitz and glamour, there was a growing sense of unease. Elvis was tired. He was tired of the same old routine, the endless stream of mediocre movies, and the songs that felt like they were written by robots. He grumbled to Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires, "What am I supposed to do with this piece of shit?" when faced with a terrible song to record. But he always obediently got on and sang it, no matter how much he hated it. Elvis wasn't a businessman, and he didn't understand the intricacies of the music industry. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, handled all of that. The Colonel was a shrewd negotiator, and he made sure that Elvis's contracts were lucrative, but at what cost? The Colonel insisted on using only songs from writers who would share publishing deals with his partners, the Aberbachs. This meant that Elvis often ended up with subpar material, but he didn't say anything. He was afraid of confrontation, and the Colonel was too powerful. Elvis knew that the bad songs and poor movies were damaging his career. He realized that he could earn less and have bigger hits if he had more control over his material. But he never had the guts to tell the Colonel that. Instead, he would sigh and do as he was told, feeling increasingly trapped. When he wasn't filming, Elvis would retreat to his lavish home in Bel Air. He'd play with his chimpanzee, Scatter, who had been trained to lift the skirts of young women to peek at their underwear. The guys found it hilarious, but Elvis sometimes wondered if it was all just a bit too much. He'd spend hours on the phone with Priscilla, a young girl he'd met in Germany while he was in the army. She was beautiful, innocent, and reminded him of his mother. He'd send her records and call her late at night, talking for hours. But he was also dating Anita, a girl from Memphis, and the two relationships were starting to weigh on him. One night, while a party raged downstairs, Elvis locked himself in his bedroom and called Priscilla. He talked to her about his mother, who had died a few years earlier, and about how much he missed her. He promised Priscilla that she could visit him in Los Angeles, and he would take care of her. He told her that she would be chaperoned at all times, but deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Elvis's life was a mix of public adoration and private turmoil. He was the king, but he felt like a prisoner in his own kingdom. He had everything he could want: money, fame, and adoring fans, but he was unhappy. He missed his mother, he was tired of the same old songs, and he was starting to realize that the life he was living wasn't what he truly wanted. But how could he change it? The Colonel had a tight grip on his career, and Elvis didn't know how to break free. He was stuck, and the more he tried to escape, the more he felt the chains tightening around him. Elvis was back on top with the hit song Return to Sender, but his excitement was short-lived. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, was negotiating a big tour with RCA for 1963, spanning 43 cities. Elvis loved performing, but the Colonel wanted $1 million advance. RCA thought that was too much and suggested a smaller tour with less money up front. The Colonel refused, and the tour never happened. His ego and greed had cost Elvis a major opportunity. With his girlfriend Anita gone, Elvis invited Priscilla to spend Christmas at Graceland. Despite promises to her parents, things didn't go as planned. Priscilla was jet-lagged and couldn't sleep, so Elvis gave her some Placidil. She ended up sleeping for almost 2 days and missed Christmas. The guys were worried and wanted to call an ambulance, but Elvis didn't. He walked her around his bedroom until she woke up. It was a dangerous move, and Elvis was often careless with prescription drugs, even though he read a lot about them. Priscilla's life changed dramatically when she moved to Graceland. She went from a normal teenage life to living in a house filled with people. The only place she could talk to Elvis alone was in his bedroom. He asked if she wanted to live at Graceland, and she said yes, even though her parents were against it. Elvis charmed her parents over the phone, and soon Priscilla was living in Memphis with Elvis's parents, Vernon and Dee. She went to a Catholic high school, and was driven to and from school by Vernon. She couldn't make friends or invite anyone over, and she felt very isolated. Elvis was protective and jealous of Priscilla. He didn't want her to talk to the guys, thinking she might be flirting. They watched TV in bed, and sometimes he took sexy Polaroid photos of her in her school uniform. Priscilla wanted a more intimate relationship, but Elvis wasn't ready for that. The local press didn't report on Priscilla living at Graceland. Elvis was loved in Memphis, and the press didn't want to risk their relationship with him. When a local journalist spotted Elvis and Priscilla together, he only asked about movies, not about Priscilla. Elvis left for Hollywood to film Viva Las Vegas with Anne Margaret. They hit it off quickly, and Elvis spent a lot of time with her, even riding motorcycles together. Anne Margaret charmed everyone, but the Colonel wasn't a fan. He complained to MGM about the cost overruns and too many close-ups of Anne Margaret. Elvis was embarrassed by the Colonel's interference, but didn't stand up for her. Priscilla read about Elvis and Anne Margaret in the newspapers and was upset. Elvis lied to her, saying Anne Margaret was just a friend. Despite the tension, they finished the movie, and Elvis rushed back to Memphis. He called Anne Margaret every day, but he also committed to Priscilla. When Priscilla confronted him about a rumor that Anne Margaret was engaged to him, Elvis said he wanted a woman who would understand his life. Priscilla felt pressure to be that woman. Elvis's next movie, Kissin' Cousins, was a low point. It was a cheap, quick production, and Elvis hated it. He continued to see Anne Margaret, but their relationship was coming to an end. He wanted someone who would always be waiting for him at home, and that person was Priscilla. In 1964, Elvis watched the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show, and realized something new was happening. The Beatles were taking over, and Elvis felt out of touch. He had always been popular in the UK, but now the Beatles were dominating the charts. He was jealous and knew the Beatles were serious competition. Some of his friends dismissed them as a fad, but Elvis knew better. The Beatles were different, and they were changing the music scene. He sent a polite telegram welcoming them to the US, but deep down, he wasn't happy about their success. The Beatles were charming everyone, from kids to adults, and Elvis felt left behind. Elvis watched the Beatles on TV, feeling a mix of emotions. He thought about his own career, how he'd been so careful to be respectful, just like the Colonel had taught him, but the Beatles were different. They were bold, playful, and didn't seem to care about the rules. Elvis envied that they shared the spotlight equally, something he and his bandmates, Scotty, Bill, and J, had never experienced. Musically, the Beatles puzzled him. They weren't as polished as the Nashville A Team, but they were innovative and full of energy. Their harmonies weren't as smooth as the Everly Brothers, but they had a unique, boyish charm. Elvis couldn't help but like their early songs, especially I Saw Her Standing There. He admired how they wrote their own hits, and how they could cover songs by Little Richard and Chuck Berry with such skill. Elvis started to notice a change in the music scene. The Beatles' songs had a slower rhythm and a heavy beat that made people want to dance individually, not in pairs. He wondered if his own music, with its fast-paced rock and roll, was still relevant. The Colonel didn't seem to think so, but the Colonel didn't really understand music. Elvis had recorded a version of Chuck Berry's Memphis, Tennessee, a month before the Beatles arrived in the U.S. He thought it was his best rock and roll recording since Little Sister, but he hesitated to release it. He worried that it might get lost in the Beatles' hype. While he was waiting, Johnny Rivers released his own version of Memphis, Tennessee, and it went to #1. Elvis was upset and put his recording aside, feeling like he'd missed his chance. Elvis had another movie coming up, called Roustabout. He tried to convince himself that being a film star was better than being just a musician. But he knew he was stuck in a series of predictable movies with silly dialogue. He was contracted to make more films, and he couldn't escape the rut. When Elvis saw the Beatles dominate the Billboard charts, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. In the studio, he snapped at the director during a session for a roustabout song. The director's comment about the Jordanaires made Elvis lose his temper, and he lashed out. At home, Elvis struggled with his fame. He couldn't go to church anymore, but the religious teachings from his parents stayed with him. He often wondered why he had become so famous. Was it luck, or was there a divine plan? He thought about his twin brother, Jesse, who had died at birth. If God had a purpose, why had he chosen Elvis? Elvis found some solace in a hairdresser named Larry Geller. Geller introduced him to Eastern religions and metaphysics. Elvis read books like Autobiography of a Yogi and The Prophet. He became deeply interested in spirituality, spending hours talking with Geller and scribbling notes in his books. His friends and family were divided in their opinions about Geller. Some thought he was a positive influence, while others were jealous and suspicious. Priscilla, Elvis's girlfriend, was supportive but also frustrated. Elvis's newfound spirituality made him distant, and he even expected her to read the same books. He preached about controlling desires, including sex, which made her feel neglected. The Colonel was furious about Geller's influence, calling it bullshit, and worrying that Elvis was losing focus. Elvis's spiritual journey led him to visit places like the Self-Realization, Fellowship Lake Shrine. He even tried LSD, influenced by Timothy Leary's book. Despite his newfound interests, he remained a popular figure, even if he was seen as more conservative than other rock stars. For a while, Elvis considered giving up his singing career to spread his spiritual beliefs. But when he met a spiritual leader named Sri Amata, she gently convinced him that his true purpose was to continue singing. This reassured Elvis, and he returned to his music, though his confidence was still shaken. Throughout the mid-60s, Elvis's musical career was on hold. He made one movie after another, each with a similar plot and forgettable songs. He recorded It Hurts Me, a heartfelt ballad, but it was overshadowed by the lightweight hit Kissin' Cousins. His frustration grew as he realized that his music was no longer as innovative or exciting as it once was. Despite this, Elvis kept going, hoping to find his way back to the top. Scotty Moore used to play rhythm guitar during Elvis's movie sessions, but he wasn't happy about it. He thought neither Colonel Parker nor Freddie Bienstock at Hill and Range had Elvis's best interests at heart. He was right, but it was frustrating for everyone involved, especially the executives at RCA. They wanted Elvis to record more than just soundtrack albums, which were selling less and less each year. But Colonel Parker only saw records as a way to promote Elvis's movies, where he thought the real money was. The music business was changing in the 1960s. Songwriters wanted to be recording artists themselves, and weren't willing to give up their royalties for Elvis to sing their songs. In the 1950s, getting Elvis to sing your song was like winning the lottery, but that wasn't the case anymore. Parker and the Aberbocs kept trying to strong-arm songwriters into giving Elvis their songs for a cut of the royalties, but it was greedy and short-sighted. Elvis could have reached out to top writers like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who would have been thrilled to write for him, but Parker and the Aberbocs never did. Elvis only got to sing songs he truly loved occasionally, like Chuck Berry's Memphis, Tennessee. He didn't stand up to Parker more often because he was afraid. Parker had lifted Elvis and his family out of poverty, and Elvis was grateful. He feared that if he argued too much, Parker might drop him, and he would lose everything he had worked for. Elvis and his father, Vernon, weren't very savvy with money. They didn't have complex financial plans or investments. Vernon managed Elvis's money in a straightforward way money came in, and went into the bank to be spent as needed. Despite earning millions, Elvis even had to take out a mortgage to buy land near Graceland to keep it private. To the world, Elvis seemed like a powerful rock star who could do anything, but he didn't feel that way. He wanted to tour Britain, but Parker never allowed it. The other guys in Elvis's circle often wondered how Parker could reduce such a commanding figure to subservience. Parker would remind Elvis that the money from movies was much more than from music. In 1964, Elvis earned $1,508,000 from movies, and only $506,000 from music, paying $784,000 in taxes. Elvis started to feel trapped by his lifestyle and the greed of his manager and publishers. He would show up on movie sets, learn his lines on the way, and try to relieve his frustrations by practicing karate between scenes. The recording studio, once his creative space, became less important. He would let the band record backing tracks without him and dub his voice later, which made the songs feel less personal. Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires noticed how Elvis would back away from the microphone as he sang, feeling that the material was so bad he couldn't perform it well. Elvis would mock his own performances when screening his movies with his friends. He was hurt by comments from producer Hal Wallis and Colonel Parker about the quality of his movies. He realized that both Wallis and Parker had been less than honest with him. Elvis wasn't making many records or touring, and his movies took only a few months of his time. He had a huge appetite for work, and would often rent out the Memphian Theater to watch movies all night. He loved classic films and even the Beatles A Hard Day's Night. Despite disliking Hollywood, he was a movie buff. When not working, Elvis would read, watch football games, and enjoy TV shows like The Fugitive. He also loved driving a motorhome down Route 66, sometimes giving hitchhikers rides and surprising them with his identity. He enjoyed the attention from fans and would often drive to the gates of Graceland to talk to them. Elvis's relationship with Priscilla was unique. She fit into his life, but he didn't want her to go to college. He wanted her to be a glamorous partner, so she took dance and modeling classes. She became the perfect, obedient consort, as he liked to style her. In 1965, RCA found an old recording of Crying in the Chapel that Elvis had left off a gospel album. They released it as a single, and it became a big hit, reaching number 3 in the US and number 1 in the UK. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The Beatles, who had taken over the world, were about to visit Elvis at his home in Bel Air. On a Friday night in August 1965, the Beatles arrived at 525 Perugia Way. Everyone in Elvis's house was excited, but Elvis wasn't. He thought it was a publicity stunt, and didn't want to pretend to be happy about their success. He and Priscilla, along with their friends, were watching TV when the Beatles arrived. Priscilla was dressed up, and Elvis was nervously playing a bass guitar. He wasn't sure how to act, but he had to face them. Elvis stepped back from the front door, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Despite his best intentions, he couldn't bring himself to greet his guests. It wasn't like him to be so absent, but something about this evening felt different, almost forced. Suddenly, the room was bursting with energy, the Beatles and their entourage spilling in, bright and cheeky. The Colonel, always the master of arrangements, was there, along with Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, and a few others. Chris Hutchins, a young English journalist, had orchestrated the meeting, and the atmosphere was tense, almost starched. Elvis usually excelled at putting strangers at ease, but tonight, the 4 Beatles just stared at him, their expressions a mix of puzzled embarrassment. He tried to break the ice with a joke. "Well, if you guys are just going to sit and stare at me, I'm going to bed." It worked a little, and the tension eased slightly. He mentioned the news about the Beatles' plane engine catching fire on their way to Portland. John Lennon had quipped, "Beatles and children first," a line that brought some laughter. Elvis shared his own near-miss stories, like the time his small plane ran out of fuel on the way to a recording session in Nashville in 1956, or when fans in Vancouver stormed the stage, forcing him and the band to run for their lives. Despite the stories, the conversation felt stilted and superficial. John Lennon, trying to be funny, put on a Peter Sellers accent, but it fell flat. Elvis, feeling edgy, started playing the bass line to Charlie Rich's "Mohair Sam" on his Fender. Paul McCartney, the Beatles' bass player, showed interest, and they compared notes. Paul tried to lighten the mood, joking, "You're coming along quite well, Elvis. Keep up the rehearsals, and Mr. Epstein and I will make you a star." Music seemed to be the best way to communicate, so Elvis suggested they jam. Only Ringo was left out, as there was no drum kit. "Sorry, there's no drum kit for you," he said to Ringo, who shrugged and headed to the pool table with Elvis's cousin Billy Smith. The Colonel set up a roulette game in a corner, and the road managers chatted, leaving the women to watch in near silence. The jam session was the highlight of the evening, with Memphis, Tennessee, Johnny B. Goode, and C.C. Ryder filling the room. Elvis usually loved jamming, but tonight, even the music felt strained. The guests stayed until nearly 2 in the morning. But the best moments were between Elvis's gang and the Beatles' road manager, Mal Evans, who was a huge Elvis fan. Elvis felt like an outsider, aware that everyone was watching him to see how he'd react to the Beatles, who had eclipsed him. His hair, once a trademark of teenage delight, was now short and stiff, unlike the Beatles' natural boyish locks. George Harrison, very stoned, wandered outside to look at the garden, while Paul McCartney did his best to keep the conversation going. John Lennon, with a drink in hand, was his usual abrasive self, but his comments, though blunt, were meant with respect. At one point, the conversation turned to rock and roll, and both Paul and John admitted how much they loved Elvis's early records. Elvis, trying to stay positive, said he was thinking of recording more like that. John's response, "Oh good, we'll buy them when you do," stung a little. John was known for his bluntness, but Elvis took it as a criticism of his current music. Priscilla, Elvis's wife, thought the evening went well, but she noticed that Elvis didn't ask the Beatles a single question about themselves. It felt like the Beatles and their friends were all in on a private joke, and Elvis wasn't included. John, more than a little drunk, thanked Elvis in a mock European accent. "Thank you for the music, Elvis. Long live the king." It sounded sarcastic, but Lennon meant it. Brian Epstein invited Elvis and Priscilla to a return evening at the Beatles' rented house, but Elvis made an excuse. "We'll see," he said, knowing it meant they wouldn't go. He was used to being the center of attention, and that wouldn't happen at the Beatles' place. Some of Elvis's friends went to the Beatles' house the next night, and John Lennon went out of his way to tell them that he wanted Elvis to know. "If it hadn't been for Elvis, I would have been nothing." Elvis never met any of them again. The encounter with Paul McCartney about bass playing brought up Bill Black, the bass player who had opened for the Beatles on their first U.S. tour. Bill's health was failing, and he had been diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor. Elvis visited him, telling Bill's wife, Evelyn, that they could ask for anything they needed. Vernon and Dee went to Bill's funeral, and Scotty and DJ Fontana were pallbearers, but Elvis didn't attend, not wanting to turn it into a circus. Evelyn and her children visited Graceland afterward, and despite their differences, they still saw Elvis as the boy they had first met in 1954. Elvis felt a deep sense of loss. Those days with Bill Black, Scotty, and D.J. had been the happiest and most exciting of his career. He often reminisced about the fun they had touring small towns, playing anywhere they could. Bill was a very great man. He told a Memphis newspaper the day before the funeral, "This comes as such a very great shock to me that I can hardly explain how much I loved him." Elvis's return to Nashville in May 1966 was marked by a renewed passion for recording. He planned a religious album, How Great Thou Art, with a big church sound. 11 backing singers and a 14-piece band were assembled, and Elvis, under the guidance of new producer Felton Jarvis, was determined to create something special. The album, a mix of traditional spirituals and hymns, would become his only Grammy-winning work. The first track, Run On, showcased Elvis's fiery, playful preacher style. The album's title track, suggested by Charlie Hodge, would become a highlight of his live shows. But RCA also wanted hit singles, and Elvis's judgment on commercial material was no longer as sharp. He recorded Down in the Alley, a forgotten R&B hit, and Tomorrow is a Long Time, a Bob Dylan song he had heard on an Odetta album. Both were carelessly included in a movie soundtrack album, overlooked and forgotten. The first single, Love Letters, did well in the UK but flopped in the US. The next two singles died in the charts, and I'll Remember You, a Hawaiian favorite, met the same fate. Elvis was depressed, knowing that his career was in freefall. He was being laughed at in Hollywood, and his options were narrowing. He pretended to be glad to say goodbye to producer Hal Wallis, but the reality was that Wallis and Paramount were dumping him. His career was in trouble, and he felt like a failure. To Priscilla and his friends, he blamed the conveyor belt of beach movies. "Hollywood has lost sight of the basics. They are a lot of fancy talkers who like to pigeonhole you," he would say, but he had gone along with the pigeonholing. He never criticized the Colonel publicly, and when presented with a new contract giving Parker 50% of some of his earnings, he didn't argue. Was he afraid to? By the end of 1966, Elvis was feeling lost. He would sometimes seek spiritual guidance from Sri Dayamata at the Self-Realization Fellowship, but it didn't bring him the clarity he craved. Back at Graceland, he donated $100,000 to Memphis charities and gave a rare interview to Jim Kingsley of the Memphis Commercial Appeal. It was Christmas, and Elvis reminisced about a memorable moment from 1954. He and his bandmates, Scotty and Bill, had just been paid for a gig and were stopped by the police for speeding. "There goes my Christmas money for a traffic ticket," he thought, but the cop let them off with a warning. They counted their money by the car headlights, mostly in dollar bills, and Elvis blew it all on Christmas presents the next day. Elvis reflected on how different Christmases were now. Growing up in East Tupelo, he felt that the friendships and devotion were what truly mattered, not the spending. As he talked, he became pensive, remembering the simplicity of his youth. Now, life was about to become more real for him in another way. After living with Priscilla for over 4 years, he finally proposed, partly due to pressure from her stepfather. Elvis had always loved westerns, from Roy Rogers movies to TV shows like Rawhide. He bought Palominos for himself and Priscilla, but the pasture at Graceland was too small. He found a perfect ranch in the North Mississippi Hills, with a lake, a barn, and a beautiful house. The ranch, called Circle G, cost $450,000, which outraged his father, Vernon. But Elvis wanted it, so a mortgage was arranged. He also bought more horses, saddles, and clothes for his entourage, spending a total of nearly $98,000. His father was furious, but Elvis didn't care. Elvis's new hobby also included buying pickup trucks for his friends and trailers for their families. One day he bought 8 pickup trucks, and even his grandma got a trailer. But his spending wasn't just about generosity. He had a dentist in Los Angeles who could write prescriptions for pills, and a pharmacist in Memphis who would supply them. With his name, he could get almost anything he wanted. Despite his new expenses, Elvis still had to make money. His next movie, Clambake, was another in a long line of similar films. He didn't want to make it, and tried to delay shooting by claiming he was saddle sore from horse riding. He even got a new doctor, George Nishapoulos, to prescribe ointment. When he finally arrived in Los Angeles, he was overweight and had to delay shooting again. One night, he slipped and hit his head on the bathtub, suffering a concussion. The Colonel, Tom Parker, arrived with a medical team. He was more concerned about Elvis's drug use than his injury. Parker warned Elvis that he would ruin his career and lose Graceland if he didn't change his ways. Graceland was Elvis's pride and joy, and the thought of losing it terrified him. Parker then turned his anger on Elvis's entourage, telling them they had failed to take care of him. He ordered Larry Geller to remove all of Elvis's religious books, and from then on, Geller's job would be just as a hairdresser. Parker also hinted that some of the guys should start looking for new jobs. Elvis felt humiliated, but knew he had to listen. On May 1st, 1967, he and Priscilla were married in a private ceremony at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. The Colonel stage managed the event, and only a few close friends were invited. Red, one of Elvis's oldest friends, wasn't invited, which devastated him. Elvis was mortified when he realized what he had done. After the ceremony, the newlyweds flew to Palm Springs, and then to the Circle G Ranch for their honeymoon. For a few weeks, they enjoyed a simple life, almost like camping out. Priscilla felt happy to have Elvis to herself, and their relationship seemed to grow stronger. Before the honeymoon was over, Priscilla discovered she was pregnant. Elvis's life was changing, but the pressure to make more movies continued. He was set to star in Speedway, where he played a singing stock car driver. Despite his new role as a father-to-be, he still couldn't resist pursuing other women. The Colonel's talk of change hadn't yet reached the part of Elvis's life that needed it most. Elvis was at a low point. His once soaring career in the rock world had taken a nosedive, and the Beatles were making history with their groundbreaking album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He needed a hit, and fast. One day, while driving around, he heard a song on the radio that caught his attention. It was Jerry Reed's Guitar Man. Though it hadn't been a hit, there was something about it that appealed to Elvis. Determined to make it his own, Elvis headed to Nashville to record it. But when he got there, he faced a problem. None of the session guitarists could match the energy and flair of Jerry Reed's original. The only solution was to bring Jerry Reed himself into the studio. After a quick fishing trip on the Cumberland River, Reed arrived at the studio, looking more like a wild man than a professional musician. Despite his appearance, Elvis and the producer, Felton Jarvis, were excited to have him. The recording session was a blast from the past. Elvis and Jerry Reed worked together, and the song turned into a duet, with Elvis's voice and Reed's guitar creating magic. Guitar Man became one of the best-produced Presley singles in years. Buoyed by the success, they immediately recorded another classic, Big Boss Man. However, there was a snag. Freddie Bienstock, who usually handled Elvis's publishing, hadn't secured the rights to Guitar Man. When he tried to get Jerry Reed to agree to a deal, Reed refused, saying he had already wasted everyone's time and wasn't going to give up his song. Despite the tension, Elvis loved the recording and insisted it be released. Jerry Reed's stand brought a breath of fresh air to the recording process, which had been bogged down by ego and self-interest. The next day, Elvis and his team jammed on High Heel Sneakers, another R&B classic. This was a significant moment, as it showed a willingness to return to the roots of his music. Elvis's career in Hollywood was on the decline. He had made 25 films, but none of them were with top-tier producers or directors. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, realized it was time to pivot. He pitched NBC a plan for a Christmas special, but Elvis had other ideas. He wanted to show the world what he was really capable of. Against Parker's wishes, Elvis pushed for a more dynamic and authentic TV show. As the TV negotiations began, Elvis's life at the Circle G Ranch was coming to an end. The expenses and the upkeep were too much, and he decided to sell the property. Priscilla, his wife, found a house in Beverly Hills, closer to where Elvis would be working. This change marked a new chapter in their lives. On February 1, 1968, Elvis and Priscilla welcomed their daughter, Lisa Marie, into the world. Being a father brought a new sense of joy and responsibility to Elvis. The TV special, known as the '68 Comeback Special, was a turning point. Elvis worked closely with the director, Steve Binder, to create a show that would showcase his versatility. The jam session, where Elvis performed with his old friend Scotty and DJ Fontana, was the highlight. Despite his initial nerves, Elvis delivered a powerful performance, especially on the song, If I Can Dream, a heartfelt tribute to the ideals of peace and brotherhood. The show was a massive success, with 42% of the American viewing public tuning in. The single, If I Can Dream, climbed the charts, and the album of the show was a hit. Elvis's career was back on track. After the success of the TV special, Elvis and his team discussed their next steps. A return to the studio was on the horizon, and Marty Lacker, a friend, suggested recording in Memphis at the American Sound Studio. The studio was known for its talented house band, and it seemed like a perfect fit for Elvis's next project. Elvis was ready to make a comeback, and the future looked bright. Elvis's journey to the stage of the International Hotel in Las Vegas was a long and winding road. After years of making movies that often felt more like obligations than opportunities, he was ready for a change. The Colonel, his manager, had always been cautious, but Elvis was determined to take control of his music and his career. He wanted to show the world what he could do, and he knew that the stage was the place to do it. In the winter of 1969, Elvis recorded a series of songs that would define his new direction. He worked with a new band and a new producer, Chip Smallman, at the American Sound Studio in Memphis. The studio was old and a bit run down, but it had a special vibe. Elvis felt at home there, and the songs they created were powerful. In the Ghetto became one of his biggest hits, despite the worries of those around him that it might be too political. But Elvis believed in the song and knew it was something special. During this time, Elvis also had a chance to connect with some of his musical heroes. He met gospel singer Mahalia Jackson and discovered that he still had a lot to learn. Even though he was a star, he was humble and eager to grow as an artist. But the Colonel always had a say, and sometimes Elvis's dreams had to wait. The biggest challenge came when Elvis needed to put together a band for his upcoming Las Vegas show. His old friends, Scotty, DJ, and the Jordanaires, were busy with other commitments and couldn't join him. This was a tough blow, but Elvis didn't give up. He found James Burton, a talented guitarist, and together they built a new band. He also chose the Imperials as his gospel quartet, and the Sweet Inspirations as his backup singers. With a full band and a large group of musicians, Elvis was ready to take on Las Vegas. The night before his first show, Elvis was nervous. He had never performed in such a big, fancy place before. But when he stepped onto the stage in a black karate suit, all his nerves disappeared. He played Blue Suede Shoes and other classic hits, and the audience went wild. Elvis moved and sang with a new energy, and the show was a huge success. People who had written him off in Hollywood were shocked by how good he was. He was back and he was better than ever. That first night in Las Vegas was a turning point for Elvis. It wasn't just about the music. It was about proving to himself and the world that he could still be the best. He had overcome the obstacles and was finally in control of his career. From that moment on, Elvis was a different performer. He was no longer just a movie star or a rock and roll icon. He was a live performer who could connect with his audience in a way that no one else could. The show ended with "Can't Help Falling in Love," a beautiful and emotional song that left the audience spellbound. As the curtain fell, Elvis knew that he had found his true calling. The movies were in the past, and the future was on stage. He had one of the most exciting nights of his life, and he was just getting started.